This concept of competitiveness from a country perspective, we look at factors such as financial and institutional structures. We look at the labor market and the efficiency of the labor market. We look at issues such as health and primary education. And South Africa's quite an anomalous situation because South Africa fares fantastically well in terms of the soundness of our banks, in terms of the regulation of our stock exchange, in terms of our auditing standards. In fact, we amongst the top 3 in the world in terms of some of these areas. But then we also have areas where we lag quite significantly, issues of health and primary education, issues of technological readiness, an issue about around labor market efficiency. And fortunately or unfortunately, these are fundamentals in terms of how we see economies growing. And they really, I would say, sacrosanct in terms of the growth of an economy. And we see the knock-on implications of not having those fundamentals in place.
We've seen South African companies become more competitive. We've seen lots of companies, for example, expand in Africa.
Sure, I think, to put into perspective, imagine if we had a highly competitive environment and we had labor markets that were conducive to allow for foreign direct investment to come into the country. Imagine if we had labor markets that were efficient, that would allow companies to be more profitable while still providing for equitable distribution. I think the South African narrative is interesting. 23 years into democracy, the conversation has really changed from one of this being the rainbow nation and the darling of the international community between 1994 and 1997. Today, South Africa is one country amongst 200 odd countries in the world. And so we have to play on that international stage. Yes, South African companies have been successful in terms of the internationalization, but we're starting to see quite a bear in terms of the economic growth of the country, and that's having an impact on companies in South Africa.
We have seen some countries, though, move up those competitive rankings.
We see economies like Mauritius, we don't necessarily have the size of companies that we have in the South African economy, that doesn't have the sophisticated stock exchange that we have, that doesn't necessarily maybe have the type of natural resources or manufacturing capacity that we have, but they've managed to grow quite significantly in terms of the competitiveness index. The other example is when we look at entrepreneurial activity in South Africa, and you look at the Global Entrepreneurial Monitor, total entrepreneurial activity in South Africa sits at 7%, and the average in Africa is around 27%. And so when you do this contrast, South Africa sits on the outside of the average within Africa, and we're often stripped out of that equation because we bear the equation down. And entrepreneurship is often seen as the panacea to address some of the challenges for the 18 million people who live below $1.50 a day. I think the corporate sector can employ a certain number of individuals, government can employ a certain number of individuals, and I think we've reached saturation point both in the private sector and public sector. And so many times we see this argument around entrepreneurship being the panacea for addressing some of the challenges in South Africa. But you have to put it into perspective. Do we have the requisite enabling environment to be able to allow entrepreneurs to flourish in this economy? Have we allowed for high growth technology entrepreneurs to come to the fore in the South African economy? Have we allowed the type of financing mechanisms that have made some of the other emerging market economies so successful in terms of entrepreneurship? And the bulk of entrepreneurs that we see in South Africa, according to the Monitor, is largely necessity entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs who, because and as a result of a significant unemployment rate in the country, have no option but to be entrepreneurs. And so they don't necessarily employ individuals within that sector. I think the key for us is, one, how do we integrate a very robust, a very successful private sector economy with a more entrepreneurial spirit that we see amongst individuals in the country and really get entrepreneurial activity up. Number two, how do we try and bring government and business more closely aligned in terms of increasing our competitiveness as a country?
We're a resource-based economy. The fact that you've got super cycles up and down on the resource side, does that contribute to our level of competitiveness?
We're definitely impacted by the vagaries of the commodity supercycle and the fact, as you say, we've got these massive peaks and troughs within the commodity sector. And I think that results in massive vulnerability and volatility for the South African economy. It impacts a lot of our companies within the resources sector, within the manufacturing sector, and it's also compounded by other factors such as a volatile currency rate that we see that continues to impact on many of our exporters and importers, and also has an impact in terms of the cost of goods and services within the South African economy. A basic example is the fuel price. We see the impact of a volatile currency on a fuel price, despite the fact that the price of oil has come down significantly globally. That has massive impact and implications on a number of individuals that unfortunately have a very limited bandwidth in terms of their disposable income and the impact that they can have on their families, etc., with the income that they're earning. So that's the one. I think the second one, and the impact of this massive peaks and troughs in the commodity super cycle, is what it means for individuals who are unemployed in the country at the moment. And we know the official unemployment rate in the country today sits at 25.6%. That's significant at a time when unemployment, unfortunately, has implications in terms of social stability and economic stability. So in the last week, we've seen massive unrest in streets across South Africa. And many people articulate and think that it's solely around this issue of service delivery protests. It's really systemic of the impact and implication of unemployment. When individuals can't feed their families, when individuals can't sustain themselves on a daily basis, unfortunately, they're going to rise up and speak out about it.
If we look at the top 5 countries that are always within the top 5 in the competitiveness index, what are some of the lessons that we can draw from those countries?
So I often say, we've got the big S's in that top 5, and you've got Switzerland, you've got Singapore, you've got Sweden. Singapore's interesting, right? I mean, Singapore had a very low GDP per capita 50 years ago. Today, Singapore is the most innovative country in the world and one of the most competitive countries in the world. At the heart of Singapore's competitiveness was, one, the ability to get the basics right, to look after education, housing, healthcare, and to be able to integrate some of those fundamentals into the broader economy. So as an example, a number of individuals in Singapore are given fully funded scholarships by the government of Singapore to go and study at some of the best universities in the world. And the prerequisite is that they come back with a master's or PhD, come back to Singapore and then work for 6 years in the private sector in 3 different industries. So you'll work for 2 years in financial services, 2 years in retail, 2 years in insurance. And then you average age about 34, 35 years old, and you go and work for the government of Singapore. And working for the government of Singapore is the creme de la creme. You want to work for the government of Singapore.
It's really shifting our perception where most people in our country would like to work in the private sector as opposed to in the civil service.
100%. And I think we've got to understand the role of the civil service in terms of the dynamics of an emerging market economy. And I've started to see this really coming to the fore in a country like India. In a short space of 9 months, the government has really driven home the importance of country competitiveness, the importance of individuals within the economy to play a role in terms of the civil service. And we're starting to see a change in terms of the Indian economy. India today will grow at 7.8% as a consequence of a change in terms of how we understand the role of government and the role of leadership. I think often, and I worry about how we often lay the blame of challenges on a daily basis solely on the hands of government. I think it's a collective responsibility. And for me, the biggest concern is the fact that 51.5% of South Africans are under the age of 25, the majority of whom do not have access to higher education in this country, and so aren't allowed to be part of the broader economy. And how do we create a conducive environment where we really get those individuals, young people in this country, to be part of the broader economy?
Abdullah, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.